मेदिनि विश्वविनोदिनि नन्दिनुते गिरिवरविन्द्यशिरोदिनि वासिनि विष्णुविलासिनि जिष्णुनुते भगवति हेशिति कण्ठकुटुम्बिनि भूरि कुटुम्बिनि भूरि कृते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते सुरवरवर्षिणि दुर्धरदर्शिनि दुर्मुखमर्षिनि हर्षरते त्रिभुवनपोषिणि शङ्करतोषिणि किल्बिषमोषिनि घोषरते धनुजनि रोषिनि दितिश्रुतरोषिनि दुर्मथतोषिनि सिन्धुसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते
Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. Thank you for joining me already for the second time tonight. So today this is a fascinating paper. This paper does not say it explicitly what the title of my video is or live stream is, but it basically is that the creation of the Edo Outcaste order, which we will see is probably, I have not read this paper, which seems to me will end up sounding like the Dalits of Japan, okay? And let's see how that outcaste order was created, okay? So, who is this author? Gerald Groemer is a professor of Western and Japanese music, a professor of history of Western and Japanese music, okay? This paper came out in the Journal of Japanese Studies in 2001, okay? Let's see. Lokavya is saying an episode on Raja Rammohn Roy or Rajputana history. Rajputana history, though I don't know anyone. Raja Rammohn Roy, though we will do with Srijit Datta. The intro and outro are too long. A shorter version would be great. No, intro and outro, though, people can leave. Intro, I keep it long so that people keep joining. Okay, so people get the notification that okay, they are now live and now they can come in. Okay, let's start. The creation of the Edo Outcaste order. I'll try to maximize this as much as possible. I hope it's visible, right? Okay, so the abstract of the paper says, during the Tokugawa period, 1603 to 1868, severe sanctions against those usually known as Kawata, or derogatorily labeled Eta by others, and those labeled Hinin, literally non-human, were codified in law and backed by state force. This article, focusing on the city of Edo, traces the political and social processes that led to the creation of an outcaste order in Japan. It argues that even though ideologies of pollution and impurity may have played a role in determining who was targeted for discrimination, the production of a system of prejudice and intolerance was chiefly the result of deliberate political and economic policies of the ruling class. Sounds similar to India already. Throughout history, Japanese society has defined certain types of people or occupations as low, defiled, or as existing somehow outside society and below the majority. Polluted or base groups or occupations have been designated according to a large number of overlapping historically variable and sometimes conflicting criteria. At certain times and places, distinctions were made in a loose, informal, or piecemeal fashion. In other instances, discrimination was codified and backed by state force, producing rigid caste-like categories. Religious concepts and motivations, especially those determining defiling or polluting activities, often played an important role in defining or justifying who was placed on the bottom rung of the social order. But as Hermann Ooms, echoing the conclusions of a generation of Japanese scholars, warns, the function of pollution cannot be essentialized and granted final explanatory value. Right. Again, we see a similarity with the casteism as we know it today. Which is not the mainstream view in academia, but as people like mysterious sociologist or Declan Quigley view these things. Instead, he correctly argues it must be historicized to determine how, where, and when it was used or rejected, to discover why certain people were deemed vile, or let's see, contaminated outside society, or even non-human, requires one first to look to historically changing political, economic, and socio-cultural forces rather than to hygiene, supposed binary structures in the so-called quote-unquote Japanese mind, or the eternal verities of Buddhist or Shinto doctrine. गाली बुद्धिस्ट और शिंटोइज्म को भी दिया जाता है. Let's see the footnote. Hermanums in Tokugawa village practice class status power law, Berkeley. In Tokugawa, Japan, for example, carrying out funerals, killing animals, including four-legged ones, or handling night soil were typical activities of Buddhist monks, hunter peasants, and members of the merchant class, respectively, none of whom was considered polluted. Attempting to derive the Tokugawa period outcast order directly from concepts of pollution is no more legitimate than deducing the Inquisition from the Christian concept of sin or the Gulag from the labor theory of value. Great argument. If you say that today's casteism or Dalits are oppressed because of just Hinduism, then gulags are happening because of labor theory of value. Inquisition happened because of the Bible. Maybe so. But how do they sustain? In this study, I shall focus on two interrelated processes: the production of the outcast order in the city of Edo, the capital of the nation, and the nature and effect of the institutions that emerged from this effort. The geographical limitation I have chosen, the situation in the city of Edo, simultaneously implies a historical one beginning from around 1950, when Tokugawa Ieyasu established his political center in this town, to roughly 1868, when the upheavals of the Meiji Restoration dramatically reshaped the city and its society. Although far more outcasts resided and worked in Western Japan than in Edo, a fact in itself already demonstrating the inadequacy of any theory deriving status from generalized appeals to pollution, religion, or other ahistorically posited structures, the capital provides an important and relatively well-documented example of forces that led to the placement of certain people outside and below the majority, quote-unquote, majority society. The medieval legacy. Discriminatory practices and concepts in the medieval era were closely linked to highly heterogeneous attributes of those targeted: economic and political position, location within the division of labor, age, gender, and relationship vis-a-vis institutions of control and oppression. Moreover, ancient taboos on disease, the taking of life, and handling the dead all played a large role in determining who was targeted for discrimination. The complications, right? Yeah, the complications of terminology for naming, describing, and stigmatizing medieval people who thrived on the fringes of quote-unquote majority society reflect the complexity of social practice. Let's check the footnote, gigantic footnote. Scholars have argued for decades whether the origins of discriminated groups are located in status or occupation, domicile, social relations, or elsewhere. For a brief and lucid exposition of these issues, see Teraki Nobuaki. Kinze Mibun to Hisabetus Sumino. Okay. One appellation often recorded in contemporaneous documents is hinin, literally non-human. Originally a Buddhist expression. Lol. Hinin included a large and varied assortment of humanity. Some hinin, probably a small minority, were convicted criminals. Others were physically disabled, blind, or suffering from leprosy and abandoned by their families. Yet others were penurious vagrants, street performers, holy practitioners, or ascetics, and certain types of artisans. Hinin tended to live in specific areas of medieval cities. Of the 2027 hinin listed in a Kyoto register of 1304, some 1,000 resided at Kiyomizusaka. In Nara, many hinin dwelled at Hanyazaka. Still others congregated or worked at temples, riverbeds, and elsewhere, both in urban and rural areas, either individually or in groups. Many such people had arrived in cities after finding their possessions and property confiscated in their home provinces because they had been unable to pay taxes. Others had been the victims of natural disasters. Characterizing the status of medieval hinin remains a highly contentious undertaking. Kuroda Toshio has argued that medieval hinin were accorded a quote-unquote status beyond status. Repeatedly, the word status is coming back. Resulting from a combination of factors involving the dynamics of local communities, division of labor, class relations, and state power. Amino Yoshihiko, on the other hand, has argued that hinin were more of an occupational than a status group, and that, okay, the kind of the majority Indian argument that they are supposed to be mainly economic, occupational groups, the Jivika, occupational than a status group, and that Kuroda's view effectively prevents a proper understanding of the social situation and function of medieval Hinin. In recent years, other scholars have challenged and refined both positions, but little doubt remains that the nature of Hinin changed considerably during the course of the medieval era. At least by the end of the period, and in many instances far earlier, certain types of Hinin were regularly subject to considerable discrimination by the quote unquote majority society. Hinin were commonly mentioned together with beggars, kojiki. Both were generally disdained by those asked to provide alms. Hinin, such as lepers and those working in occupations involving sanitation, kiyome, were also usually considered lowly and defiled. Those serving as executioners or involved with butchering animals, preparing hides, or burying the dead could count with near certainty on discrimination. इसके साथ discrimination होगा ही होगा. Nevertheless, Hinin status was not simply hereditary or determined by law, nor was it linked to pollution aside from occupation or from the disease from which a Hinin was suffering. Although medieval Hinin sometimes skinned and disposed of carcasses, buried the dead, or offered performance of popular arts, begging was perhaps the most common Hinin occupation and poverty the most common Hinin trait. Even the Jesuits' dictionary of 1603 defines Finnin or Hinin simply as poor people. Nothing is said about Finnin being defiled. Bakufu officials in the early 17th century continued to be vague about the difference of Hinin and beggars. Some laws were directed at both, others at beggars alone. Although both beggars and Hinin were often scorned, as the impoverished tend to be nearly everywhere, it was not until the early 18th century that Hinin would be placed firmly in an order that relegated them to a position outside and below commoner society. Another type of discrimination, discriminated individual commonly encountered in medieval sources, particularly during the Muromachi period, is the riverbed person, or Kawara mono or Kawara no mono. On the surface, this designation appears to refer only to geography, but since quote-unquote riverbed people sometimes engaged in professions requiring access to abundant water, in particular butchering and leather production, geography was easily linked to vocation and in turn to economics. Moreover, since the riverbed was usually untaxed, Kawara mono tended to enjoy only limited rights, even after the category was that a riverbed person had become dissociated from actual domicile location. Even when the riverbed persons, so-called riverbed persons, stopped living in the riverbed, even then, that designation went on. Medieval religious concepts of pollution ensured that certain riverbed people, particularly those who worked with animal hides, meaning occupations known as kawata or kawaya, were functioned as executioners, or if they functioned as executioners, presented easy targets for discrimination. Yet, Kawaramono also included dyers, garden builders, makers of straw sandals, and countless others who had nothing to do with death. Some Kawaramono were proud that they strictly followed Buddhist precepts banning the taking of life or eating of meat. So they are being called Kawaramono, but they are absolutely against the killing of life. Others even worked at Shinto shrines where pollution was feared more than anything else. Right. So these so-called polluted people are working in so-called places which are so-called against the so-called pollution. Okay. Hinin, I believe Esraul is saying, no, I'm a firm believer of global sociology. I believe in similarities across cultures and practices. Okay. Hinin and Kawaramono were not clearly differentiated in medieval writings. Nor were these two groups always separated legally, politically, or ideologically from residents of Sanjo, or meaning scattered or marginal areas, or from a number of other types whose names vary according to the times and local practices. That at least some outcasts were subject to gradually escalating amounts of discrimination is suggested by the use of the term eta, sometimes eta or enta, which especially after the 15th century was commonly written with the characters quote-unquote much pollution, and which functioned as a particularly insulting epithet applied mainly to Kawaramono. By 1657, even the Tokugawa Bakufu was using the term eta in laws. From the mid-18th century, the use of eta, usually written with the ideographs much pollution, in official records was the rule, even though those concerned continued to refer to themselves as Kawata or less frequently as Chori. Let's see some footnotes. No. The ever more common use of the expression eta after the 16th century parallels developments in political and economic practice that fostered an increasingly rigid and hierarchical social order. Nobunaga's attempts to snuff out the rebellions of the Eco sect in the 1570s had already given rise to policies in which peasants and warrior priests on the losing side received differential treatment. But it was not until Hideyoshi's national census registers of the 1580s and 1590s that a centralized government began to register and categorize people in a thorough and formal manner. Hideyoshi's registries included categories such as Kawata, Kawaya, and Kawatsukuri, meaning leather artisan, terms that already appear to have referred to status rather than merely occupation. In registers from the Osaka area in 1594, one finds Kawata used synonymously with Kawaramono, again suggesting the existence of a discriminated status group associated with leather production. Even if registration did not simply create status distinctions from scratch, it accelerated the process by which discriminated occupational designations were turned into hereditary status categories. This is what the British did to Indians. That Hideyoshi's administration wished to solidify an easily manageable status-based social order was also made clear in 1591 with the issuance of the edict restricting change of status and residence. Okay, restricting change of status. This law, so you 1591, you can't change your status and you can't change your residence. Official bana diya. This law, which disallowed those in military service, Hokonin, from becoming peasants or townspeople, meaning chonin, was not quite the quote-unquote freezing of the social order it has often been supposed to be. Chonin or peasants, for example, were not prohibited from becoming low-ranking warriors. But its stipulations forbidding soldiers from absconding and peasants from abandoning their fields to become chonin helped to define social categories in an ever more rigid manner. I guess it could be called an unintended consequence, I guess, like how CPIM solidified the caste system unknowingly by giving out free land to farmers because they can't sell it or have too much profit anyway. So remain a poor farmer hereditary based on your family lineage. The same was true of Tokugawa period. Bakufu mandated registration requirements in which first Christians and then everyone else was ordered to register with a Buddhist temple. During the 17th, okay, let's read this footnote first. The role of the Eco sect in the establishment of the Outcaste order has been hotly debated in recent years. The creation of antagonistic status groups to divide and facilitate control of the populace may well have been in part motivated from the ruler's desire to stifle the kind of populist solidarity that had made the Eco rebellion so difficult to quash. The connection is particularly interesting because most Kawata or Eta of the Tokugawa period belong to the Jodo Shinshu sect, that is the Eco sect. Okay, during the 17th century, outcasts were beginning to be registered separately from commoners. In Osaka, for example, residents of one discriminated village were already recorded in a special Eta register by 1660. Economic factors during the late medieval period also contributed to discriminatory treatment, especially of those engaged in leather production. During the long era of civil wars, tanners and leather artisans had been in great demand by military houses, which purchased large quantities of bowstrings, protective gear, saddles, and other accoutrements which the warrior needed for his bloody job. From the 16th century at the latest, influential warlords and powerful Buddhist temples sought to secure a steady flow of leather goods to their armies by awarding leather producers and leather artisans monopoly rights and privileges, including the rights to skin and dispose of all dead horses and cows in certain areas. Sometimes leather workers were also exempt from paying certain taxes. Such duties and privileges, however, set apart the Kawata, who already tended to be linked to discriminated types of Kawaramono by the nature of their occupations. This separated them from the rest of the public. Differences between Kawata and the quote-unquote majority society were fortified when leather workers were relocated to the outskirts of town, where they could more easily be supervised and exploited. Further distance between Kawata and commoners was created when Kawata were ordered to labor as prison guards or as executioners. Although most Kawata continued to farm, pay taxes in rice, and in some cases even maintain participatory rights in village affairs, the quote-unquote majority society, which had for centuries been fed on Buddhist notions regarding the sinful nature of butchering, Shinto taboos on death and pollution, and political ideologies in which the supposed purity of the imperial house was used to bolster the authority of military regimes, now they were only too happy to relegate the Kawata to a position apart and below itself. So again, casteism in Buddhism. Indirectly. Danzemon, head of Kanto outcasts. By the late 16th century, Nobunaga and Hideyoshi's regimes centered in the Kinai region had succeeded in laying the foundations for a system in which specific people or groups of people were charged with and granted monopoly rights over collecting and processing hides, the animal skins, and turning them into leather supplied to those in power. Some of the same people were also used to carry out executions and to serve as a police force. When the Tokugawa Bakufu was founded in the city of Edo, warrior rulers began to devise an analogous system for the Kanto area. The order created was eventually headed by a man who called himself Danzemon, or more pompously Fujiwara Danzemon Yorikane, which meant the head of the Eta in the 8 Kanto provinces. Danzemon, whose name was passed down for some 13 generations, emerged from what appears to have been a bitter struggle among bosses of leather workers in the Kanto area. According to records of origins, or Yui Shogaki, that were submitted to the Bakufu in 1725 and often cited to bolster Danzemon's legitimacy. Danzemon's ancestors had originally stemmed from the province of Setsu, but had enjoyed a long association with the Chori of the Gokurakuji temple in Kamakura in the Sagami province. This institution was related to the powerful Surugaoka Hachimangu shrine, which in turn professed to have regulated all chori in the area since the days of Minamoto no Yoritomo, 1147 through 1199. This assertion is hardly tenable, but a 1584 document indicating that leather from the temple was given as tribute to the Hojo family suggests that the Hojo daimyo, who controlled the region at the time, were using the temple and the chori it controlled for the purpose of procuring leather goods. Whatever the situation may have been in early years, during the 16th century, other bosses, including one named Tarozemon, also controlled much leather production in the Sagami area when exercising judicial power over local bosses, including none other than the Chori Danzemon. By reading between the lines of Danzemon's quote-unquote records of origins, one can deduce that Tarozemon owned the document in which the last Odawara Hojo lord, Ujikatsu, granted him and not Danzemon legitimacy, even if other records suggest that the Chori of the area did not always respect Tarozemon's rule either. A 1596 or 1593 document still refers to quote-unquote leather workers of various areas and places, hinting that at this point, Danzemon was merely one boss among others. A few years later, however, Danzemon was being charged with the responsibility of procuring leather from others in the Kanto area, though he may have been involved with transportation rather than production. Predictably enough, Danzemon's quote-unquote records of origins tell a different story. According to those documents, on 1590, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August. 1st August 1590. Oh, that was March 1596. So this is 1st August 1590. Danzemon supposedly met Tokugawa Ieyasu and his men at Fuchu when the latter, when Tokugawa Ieyasu marched into Edo. It was at this time, states Danzemon, that he was certified as the legitimate boss over leather producers in the area. This assertion was no doubt a fabrication, but it is possible that the new Tokugawa regime wished to use Danzemon to weaken or purge Tarozemon and the whole old Hojo-backed order he represented. Whether Danzemon's ancestors were once residents of Sagami or not, Danzemon does appear to have resided in Edo from as early as the mid-16th century. A copy of a record dated 1559, 8-7, so 7th August 1559, lists him as a Chori dismissed from his position, living at the home of a fellow Chori at Umayabashi near Torigo in the Asakusa area. How long he remained there is unclear, but an entry in the Tensho Nikki dated 13th August 1590 suggests that some Kawata or Eta did indeed reside at Torigo during the late 16th century. According to this diary, on 1st August, when Ieyasu entered Edo, Hanasaki, the shogun's favorite horse, died and was turned over to the Eta of Torigo, a group of people again professing a history dating back to Yoritomo. Other documents, including undated annotations in the Tensho Nikki, also placed Danzemon in the Torigo area at an early age, though one also reads that he moved there only after Ieyasu's arrival. He may have previously been located at Nihonbashi Murocho. Let me have some coffee now. Let me check some comments. Let's see what's the discussion. Hmm. Okay. It must have taken time to convince Chori, who remained loyal to Tarzamon, the Gokurakuji, or other local bosses, that a new order was being created. Yet, by the first years of the 17th century, Danzamon had elevated himself to a central figure in leather procurement in Edo. His power and authority and the geographical reach of his command increased quickly thereafter. By the mid 18th century, thanks largely to Bakufu backing, he had succeeded in solidifying his grip on nearly all Kawata or Eta and monkey handlers in the Kanto area, as well as indirectly over the Hinin. A census of 1800 tabulates 7,720 households in the Kanto area under his supervision, of which 5,664 were classified as Eta, 1995 as Hinin, and 61 as monkey handlers. In the city of Edo, the ratio of so-called Eta to Hinin was reversed. Here, Danzamon controlled 734 Hinin households and 232 families branded Eta. Unlike the Hinin, who lived scattered throughout the city, the Kawata Eta of Edo resided on Danzamon's property at Asakusa Shincho, known as the enclosure Kakoyuchi, together with 15 houses of monkey trainers. Shincho was a long, narrow ward surrounded on all sides by temples. At the end of it stood Danzamon's residence and office, including an area for judicial proceedings, a jail, and offices for group heads, kumigashira, and assistants, tedai. Within the ward, 9 groups or associations manufactured footwear, lamp wicks, and other products, including one of leather made with the skins supplied by Hinin. In addition, at least 10 inns meaning this in this case the small restaurants and or very good small hotel sort of thing, at least 10 inns, INNS, catered to rural Kawata Eta heads who came to visit or were involved in lawsuits. Let's check these footnotes. Yeah. Is there anything important? No. Okay. Operators of these inns probably functioned as legal advisors and even handled out of court settlements. To support his administration, Danzamon extracted taxes, tribute, and labor from those he oversaw. In addition, from at least the 18th century, he maintained a lucrative monopoly on the production and sale of candle and lamp wicks in the Kanto area. Such income supplemented what Danzamon received from the Bakufu, a residence some 3,300 square meters in size and 3,000 koku of rice a year, enough to feed several thousand subordinates. To advertise his authority, he was allowed daimyo-like privileges, such as riding in a sedan chair while on official business, wearing certain types of formal garb, and even donning the quote-unquote long and short swords, a right which by the 19th century he apparently no longer exercised. Danzamon's stature as the undisputed head of a large number of outcasts residing in many provinces was unique in Tokugawa, Japan. Although in the Kyoto area, Shimomura Hikosuke or Hikoso had been appointed in 1624 as head of local Kawata or Eta and had passed his position and a stipend of over 100 koku of rice to 2 succeeding generations. The Shimomura family's headship was revoked by the Bakufu shortly after the third head's death in 1708. Instead of being controlled by one supervisor of Kawata Eta, outcast villages in this region were supervised by bosses of specially designated quote-unquote official villages or Yakunin Mura throughout the area. It remains unclear why the Bakufu chose to centralize authority in Danzamon in the Kanto region while dispersing it in the Kansai, but the decision to do so unquestionably resulted from a desire to tighten rather than loosen control in both locations. Edo Hinin bosses. The head of the Hinin or Hinin Gashira in Edo for much of the Tokugawa period was named Kuruma Zenshichi. This designation too was hereditary. Oh, so all family dynasty based, okay? Birth based. Zenshichi's origins are no longer Zenshichi's origins are no clearer than Danzamon's, but he may well have started out as a boss of penurious vagrants in the capital. From the earliest days of the city, strongmen and labor brokers controlled workers who had arrived to build the castle, roads, moats, and whatever else the fledgling metropolis needed. After the initial construction boom subsided, the same bosses were probably put to use to help control the many unemployed sector of society that city administrators must have viewed as an unruly and potentially dangerous underclass. Similar situations prevailed in other urban areas. At the end of the period of civil wars, displaced and ruined rural inhabitants streamed into almost every major city of the land. In Osaka, for example, all four major Hinin settlements appeared in surveys from 1594 to 1626 and probably arose slightly before this time. If documents from if documents from September 1839 and October 1857 can be trusted, the ancestors of Kuruma Zenshichi had once resided in Atsumi village in the province of Mikawa, the erstwhile home of the Tokugawa family. The first generation Zenshichi had supposedly moved to Edo by the time of Iesu's arrival in 1590 and was soon granted a hut, koya, at Asakusa, Okawabata. In 1608, the city magistrate appointed him as the quote-unquote head of Hinin, which at the time probably meant little more than the quote-unquote boss of indigents. Zenshichi was later awarded 500 subo, that is 1655 square meters of land at Asakusa Torigo, but on 18th November 1666, this land was confiscated for official purposes. In the second month of the following year, he was again granted 900 subo, that is 2,979 square meters at Shinwashiwara, and 35 ryo for moving expenses. This new plot of land was apparently part of the Sensoji temple at Asakusa. Maps of 1671 and 1690 indicate a settlement of beggars at this location. Zenshichi was so all basically mafia-controlled begging like today. Zenshichi was eventually placed in charge of the Hinin at Asakusa, the downtown area, and parts of the city north of Shiba. From 1687, he also ran the Asakusa Tame, a prison hospital and holding facility. His fortunes must have escalated rapidly because by the early 18th century, he was reputedly lending money to townspeople and even samurai who knew that if they did not repay, they would be greeted by bands of disgruntled Hinin outside their houses, an intolerable embarrassment for the inhabitant. Perhaps because the population of Edo was increasing rapidly, or because other bosses had existed from the outset, Zenshichi did not control all the Hinin in town. A man named Matsuemon, who had been living in Edo since 1635, was appointed the head of the Shiba Hinin during the Kanbun era, that is 1661 through 1673. Matsuemon's ancestors stemmed from the province of Mikawa, or Kai. He thought of himself as the descendant of one Chokuro, either a samurai or rich peasant who was ruined in Edo. In 1697, Matsuemon was listed as living in Shinagawa on property 50 by 28 meters in size. He was also in charge of the Hinin in the nearby Mita area and in general the southerly part of the city. At Shinagawa, he also ran a smaller tame, that sort of prison hospital, okay, and the holding facility. So small lockup, I guess. By the 1680s, both Zenshichi and Matsuemon appear to have wielded considerable power. A document from 1683 identifying several captured criminals, for example, lists one Kihei as quote-unquote a Hinin under the control of Zenshichi, 1683. Three others in 1693 are also named as being under that quote-unquote under the control of Zenshichi. In 1697, a certain Chomon is recorded as a Hinin under the control of Matsuemon. That the Hinin administration had by this time been molded into something of a hierarchical format is suggested by the mention of a sub-boss, Hinin Kogashira, in 1683, to whom a Hinin criminal was handed over. This is why individualism is better than group identity, maybe, a bit at least. As members of a broadly recognized social group in the city, such Hinin were distinguished from unregistered vagrants. As the city grew, the Hinin of the Honjo and Fukagawa areas came under the rule of one Fukagawa Zenzaburo, who lived near Aburabori. According to some records, this man was already a Hinin boss in 1701, but though he was supposedly charged with keeping the Sumida River clean in 1719, his name does not appear in 1723 documents outlining Hinin responsibilities. Perhaps he did not yet control a clearly organized group of Hinin at this date. The Hinin of the uptown Yamanote area were governed by Yoyogi no Kyubi, who is also listed as active by 1719. Little more is known of him. By the early 1720s, the Hinin administration was thus structured in a fairly clear manner, with responsibilities for law enforcement and other duties divided among four bosses. Zenshichi controlled by far the greatest number of Hinin and was considered the top leader. Matsuemon presided over at best half that number. Zenzaburo's inferiors numbered only a fraction of Matsuemon's, and Kyubi's oversaw even fewer. Like Danzemon, but on a smaller scale, each of these chiefs managed his own territory and saw to it, as best as he could, that those included followed the laws the Bakufu decreed. Now, next subchapter is called Danzemon versus Zenshichi. Let me have some coffee and check some comments a bit now. Yeah, I agree with Saugard here. The background video of tab opened is trippy, bruh. Yes. Tame is a correction facility. Yeah. Correction facility. Tame कर दिया वहां पे घुसा के इसलिए tame. Japanese culture is same as Indian culture. Shintoism has the same deities as Hinduism. Their Bushido is same as Kshatriya Dharma. True. This paper makes me think that some people have been arguing on the Hindutva side in the last 1 or 2 years that maybe it's the decentralized caste system, all the everyone self-regulating, almost automated groups like jatis. Maybe it's because of that reason that conversion of Hindus was not entirely possible. I was kind of inclined to believe that. I think I am changing my mind right now, because if that staticism is everywhere, and if there are in fact such clear distinctions of statuses and hierarchies even in Japan, who are obviously more Christian than India, and more Christian in I guess per capita or in nature. Okay, they have largely lost their indigenous cultures, more so than we have. So how did their staticism or their castes come in their rescue? It did not. So I guess we remained Hindu for some other reason, I think. Did the Inquisition spread there too? I don't know that much, but I know that the one of the bombs of the Hiroshima Nagasaki, I think the Nagasaki bomb itself was dropped on a church, which these days who's the journalist Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is going around criticizing heavily. He said he's been saying something to this effect in many podcasts these days, but he said this explicitly clearly in a recent Team Pool podcast, which happened in front of a live audience. I think Patrick Bet-David and Donald Trump Jr. were the guests. That's why it happened in front of a live audience in Florida. So after that overall live event was done, Tucker Carlson joined for a while, for 10-15 minutes, and Tucker Carlson said USA, the soul of USA, America, died in 1945 or 44 when the 45, right, when the Hiroshima and Nagasaki blasts happened. And I'm going to quote Tucker Carlson now. He says, America has not created anything of human value since 1945. America became a cursed country since dropping those two bombs. Israel is saying Japanese states and castes were more centralized. Oh, I guess I'm back on the that bandwagon of castes prevented conversion, maybe. So since they were not decentralized Indians, therefore maybe they prevented conversion, perhaps. Okay. Okay, let's continue the paper now. Continue with the paper. Danzemon versus Zenshichi. During the early years of the capital, the Kawata, Eta, and Hinin constituted two largely independent groups. In other cities, such a situation prevailed for the entire Tokugawa period. The four settlements of Osaka Hinin, for example, were each ruled by a Hinin boss or chori rather than a Kawata or Eta supervisor. Kyoto Hinin, too, lived in some 70 locations, were governed not by the Kawata Eta bosses at nearby Amabe and Rokujo villages, but rather by the quote-unquote elders or Toshiori of the hidden in temple, who in turn reported to city administrators called Zoshiki. In Edo, however, Danzemon came to enjoy an official mandate to control Zenshichi and those under him. This relation of superior and inferior was shaped not by ancient tradition or prejudices. Instead, it resulted from a series of contentious petitions, lawsuits, and countersuits taking place during the first half of the Tokugawa period. Both parties must have thought they stood to gain by taking their case to the city magistrates and obtaining a hearing. They soon discovered, however, that despite an outward appearance of propriety and fairness, according to contemporaneous ideals of differential justice, the assertions and claims of litigants were distorted and twisted by the Bakufu for the purpose of solidifying a hierarchical outcast order. Zenshichi and his men had labored for Danzemon at least since the days of the Maideki fire of January 1657, when the former were asked by the latter to help in disposing of the charred corpses of the thousands of victims. Zenshichi provided 3,285 men, or maybe 3,285 man days, for this purpose. Somewhat later, he was again ordered to supply 720 men, or 722 men days, meaning working days, I guess, to help prepare the 200 bales or hyo of rice that had been granted by the Bakufu for relief stations. Since Danzemon paid Zenshichi's men a wage at this time, the relation between the two appears not yet to have been one of boss and subordinate, but rather one of employer and labor broker. In 18th century records, however, Danzemon maintained that from 1684, Zenshichi had presented him with an annual affidavit pledging fealty, okay, meaning subordination. This may have been a misrepresentation because during the Jokyo era, 1684 through 1688, Zenshichi and Matsuemon were so little impressed by the Danzemon's superiority that they attempted to place him under their own control. A petition to the authorities to this effect was turned down, but in 1701, Zenshichi promulgated yet another set of regulations, no longer extant, which apparently again attempted to set Danzemon under Hinin control. Danzemon fought back and succeeded in relieving this Zenshichi of his post some 2 years later. The tide of the times was turning against Zenshichi, even if Danzemon could not simply abolish Zenshichi's position and assume personal control. Tensions between Zenshichi and Danzemon came to a head shortly thereafter. In 1715, the Tokugawa Bakufu indicated that it intended to clamp down on outcasters by ordering an investigation of Kyoto Kawata. In Edo, Zenshichi, together with Yoyogi no Kyubi and Fukagawa Zenzaburo, who are the Matsuemon, may well have been involved as well, okay? Perhaps all of them, sensing which direction the wind was blowing, filed suit on 1719, okay, 28 July 1719, to establish independence from Danzemon once and for all, ostensibly because the latter, meaning Danzemon, because the latter, so Danzemon was demanding the procurement of an unreasonable amount of Hinin labor power, more than 5,000 men or 5,000 man days a year. Zenshichi may also have known about an important lawsuit of 1708, in which Danzemon failed to convince the authorities that kabuki actors and those associated with the puppet theaters came under his jurisdiction. The Bakufu wavered, deciding on 27th November 1719 to halve the number of workers supplied to Danzemon, but demanding everything else be settled out of court. The magistrates found insufficient evidence to substantiate Danzemon's claim that he had allotted certain areas of the city to Zenshichi as begging turf. Since begging turf, okay, आज का भिखारियों का माफिया की तरह. Danzemon's claim that he had allotted certain areas of the city to Zenshichi as begging turf since 1652 in return for the skins of dead animals in the area. Danzemon and the city administrators who sided with him continued to pressure Zenshichi. On 8th December 1719, the latter was ordered to submit 30 workers for the city jail and 150 more in the event of a fire. In February 1720, after Zenshichi refused to produce an annual affidavit, Danzemon sued. A preliminary decision was reached on 18th November 1720, faulting Zenshichi. When the latter died in June 1721, 7 dissatisfied Hinin group heads, Kumigashira, presented a countersuit. This tactic proved fatal. On 21st December 1721, a decision was handed down against the Kumigashira based on what may have been forged evidence, which is Danzemon had submitted records indicating that since 1652 he had parceled out Edo begging areas to one Kanshichi, who he explained was the incumbent Zenshichi's ancestor, okay, the current Zenshichi's ancestor. Whether the Bakufu believed this or merely used it to end the proceedings and beef up the hierarchical outcast order it was creating, no matter what was the truth, 3 of the Kumigashira were sentenced to death, 3 to exile, later converted to life sentences, and 1 to life imprisonment. According to Danzemon's record, one of the 7 Kumigashira was so chagrined so annoyed at the verdict that he smashed his head against a wall, bit out his tongue, and died on the spot. Because once you start bleeding from your tongue, you can't live. This may have been an exaggeration, but the seven must have known. But the seven must have known they were in deep trouble. Danzemon assigned 4 guards to each convict and marched the condemned back to his residence, while city officials controlled crowds of unruly onlookers. Confiscations then took place at the residences of Zenshichi and the other captives, and the deceased Zenshichi's 13-year-old son, Kikusaburo, went into hiding. The hereditary rights of the 7 offending Kumigashira were denied in perpetuity. New Kumigashira, more amenable to Danzemon's wishes, were installed in 6th February 1722, with the young Kikusaburo promoted to the position of the new Zenshichi. On 21st June 1722, the executions of the convicts were duly carried out. Rumors regarding the incident and fictionalized descriptions of the executions spread throughout the land. 30 years later, one report even claimed that the hapless victims were taken to a riverbank near Shinagawa, buried up to their necks, and decapitated with a plow, no doubt to symbolize the non-human, indeed vegetable-like nature of Hinin. Though Zenshichi was now clearly designated as Danzemon's inferior, discord between the two erupted those two groups again erupted in the spring of 1772 when the Asakusa Tame burned down. Zenshichi was ordered to procure resources for rebuilding, which he did much to everyone's satisfaction, even pouring private funds into the project. When he was awarded an honor for his efforts, he most unexpectedly seized his moment of glory to indict Danzemon, who he asserted was lending money at unserious rates to Hinin gamblers, provoking desertions and hindering the Hinins from fulfilling their official duties. Though Danzemon professed to know nothing of such loans, Zenshichi's accusations was taken seriously enough to inspire an investigation, which concluded that some of Danzemon's subordinates had indeed been guilty of impropriety. Until this verdict was reached, however, Danzemon was placed under Zenshichi's guard, leading the gleeful Zenshichi to reassert his ancient claim that since Hinin had not been under Danzemon's control in the past, this state of affairs should be restored. Nothing more is heard of this affair, which was presumably again resolved in Danzemon's favor. Even during the 19th century, Zenshichi appears to have continued to struggle to free himself from Danzemon's yoke. According to records whose reliability is highly questionable, on one occasion, perhaps around 1838, it was discovered that Danzemon had received a substantial bribe for turning over certain begging rights in the city to the blind. Zenshichi drew up an appeal, forwarded it to the city magistrate's office, and again pleaded for equal footing with Danzemon. The magistrate, once more not entirely unconvinced by Zenshichi's contention, sought to avoid trouble by offering a vague stopgap rejoinder, which however only further provoked Zenshichi's wrath. The latter resubmitted his petition, this time adding force by rounding up a large number of comrades and staging a show of solidarity at the Asakusa Hongaji temple. This unusual display backfired, and the magistrate, wasting no time, throwing Zenshichi in jail. Not the jail for commoners run by the city magistrate, but instead the jail for outcasts, administered by none other than the defendant, Danzemon. Okay? Such an act of willful cruelty naturally further enraged Zenshichi's Hinin colleagues. Rumors were heard that the Hinin planned to assassinate the magistrate as he made his way to work. What an insanity. Okay? Listen to this. The latter, Zenshichi, resubmitted his petition, this time adding force by rounding up a large number of comrades and staging a show of solidarity at the Asakusa Hongaji temple. This unusual display backfired, and the magistrate wasted no time throwing Zenshichi in jail. So Zenshichi was sent to which jail? Not the jail for commoners, not which were run by city magistrate, but Zenshichi was sent to the jail for outcasts, administered by none other than the defendant Danzemon. Such an act of willful cruelty naturally further enraged Zenshichi's Hinin colleagues. Rumors were heard that the Hinin planned to assassinate the magistrate as he made his way to work. The escalation of tension came to an abrupt end. However, when the magistrate ordered Zenshichi be put to death, that's when the escalation came to an abrupt end. In a sorry finale to the Hinin's series of miscalculations, the succeeding Zenshichi, who for some time called himself Kyomatsu, probably to dissociate himself from his ill-fated predecessor, was forced to move to the Yanaka area, while Danzemon appointed his own man to control the Asakusa Tame. Only in 1841, when Chiyomatsu reached maturity, was he allowed to return to Asakusa and engage in his old occupation of running the Tame. After the 18th century, Zenshichi and his lieutenants must have known that defeating Danzemon had become a hopeless endeavor. To uphold their claims of independence, however, they continued to protest, petition, and sue. Even a verdict demanding an out-of-court settlement meant dialogue and the recognition that the relation between the Kawata or Eta and the Hinin was not simply one in which one side ordered while the other side silently obeyed. Yet, despite their efforts, the Hinin found themselves increasingly locked into an order in which they were ruled by the quote-unquote head of the Eta, behind whom stood the power and authority of the state. Next subchapter is called the Hinin administration. Let me have some coffee now. Niner, yes. For some reason, we don't have any written history like, yeah. Okay. Next subchapter is called the Hinin administration. The placement of Danzemon over Zenshichi would hardly have sufficed to create and reproduce structures of Hinin discrimination and exploitation. In order for this to occur, Hinin society needed to be organized in a rigorously hierarchical manner, which clearly defined duties and severely curtailed rights designated for each position within the outcast society. During the early part of the Tokugawa period, Hinin may have possessed some freedom in choosing where to make the rounds begging, but hut heads, meaning who were also called Koyagashira, Koyanushi, and Koyamochi. So these hut heads eventually parceled out territory allotted to each Hinin. Begging rights in Edo were based on a special relation, shikiri kankei, between the hut head and the administrative apparatus of each ward, a relation that did not involve Danzemon or Karuma, Danzemon or the Kuruma Zenshichi. After the 1660s, such contracts were increasingly formalized. Hinin, under the control of certain hut heads, were granted monopoly begging rights by a ward in return for fulfilling specific duties, usually connected with sanitation and petty law enforcement. Hut heads issued a special division tag or also known as shikiri fuda, staking their claim. This permit was posted at the entrance of the ward or at the door of a residence and indicated that fees had been properly paid to the Hinin hut head, thereby protecting the inhabitants from demands by other Hinin and other types of beggars. In Osaka too, a similar market purchased with a donation of 400 to 500 mon to the Hinin boss warded off wandering outcast exorcisers, performers of auspicious dances, strolling singers, and others who knew that they were not to enter such a home or yard. In Edo, agreements within Hinin were also forged with businesses on a one-by-one basis. The wealthy Mitsui family, for example, was paying money to Hinin as early as 1710. Businesses that needed help in sanitation or guarding might even grant special huts to their Hinin employees. By the early decades of the 18th century, Zenshichi presided over some 70 secondary heads, Hinin Kogashira, probably selected from the 370-odd hut heads under his jurisdiction. Matsuemon and the other Hinin leaders also lorded over smaller groups organized the same way. In total, over 700 hut heads lived in Edo in the 1790s. In addition to overseeing registered Hinin, who were called Hinin Teka or Kakai Hinin, Zenshichi was also permitted to control Nidayu. The Nidayu was the boss of Gomyun, or common street performers in Edo, considered Hinin only so long as they engaged in this occupation. As long as you take part in street performing, only then you will be considered Hinin. One of the most important functions of the Hinin administration was to transmit and enforce laws aimed at Hinin. From the late 17th century, such sanctions became increasingly onerous. In February 1674, Edo city administrators ordered Hinin, ordered them to, who live within the wards and those who live on nearby riverbanks or at open areas, them, Hirokoji, to register and accede to new measures of control. For the time being, imposing adequate order on such people seems to have proven too arduous, leading supervisors to decree that while waiting for their orders, These hinin were quote unquote allowed to go where they please as before. On 9th August 1680, however, a new edict was handed down to the ward heads, Nanushi, by the town elder Naraya Ichiemon. That edict said, quote, because hinin in town are causing trouble, the two hinin heads, Zenchichi and Matsuemon, have been summoned to today's meeting and ordered to accommodate all hinin during nighttime hours. No hinin should be present in the city during the night. If there are any hinin huts within the city, these should be torn down tomorrow. If hinin beg in threatening ways at felicitous daytime functions, they are to be arrested and brought to the office of the city magistrates. If hinin break the law by staying in town during the night, they are of course also to be arrested and brought to the office of the magistrates. This ordinance has been promulgated by the office of the city magistrates. Hereafter it must be obeyed. End quote. Let's check this footnote. It's interesting. Hinin houses were cramped even by standards of the day, with an entire family often living in a dwelling measuring as small as 3 by 4 meters. Some edifices in which a large number of inhabitants must have dwelled measured up to 8 by 11 meters, but this was unusual. Okay, listen to the condition of the Dalits of Japan. During the same month, another law noted that Edo beggars and hinin were reputed to be engaging in petty theft and irritating forms of solicitation. It was again decreed that no hinin were to reside in the commoner quarters at any time. Hinin huts were ordered torn down within 3 days and occupants turned over to Zenchichi. Entries in later judicial records, which often give addresses in the Edo commoners' quarters for hinin defendants, suggest, however, that such laws proved largely ineffective. To render hinin status obvious to all, the Bakufu set about requiring that visible differences be made between hinin and others, including Kawata or Eta. Some codes or customs regarding hinin appearance had, it seems, been taken for granted in earlier years. But from the second decade of the 18th century, new and more stringent laws were issued, demanding that hinin be stigmatized in more obvious ways. Ambiguity nahi chahiye. In November 1723, on the pretense of an anti-arson campaign, officials began to round up suspected culprits, including a good number of hinin, some of whom looked far too much like quote-unquote regular people or sune no mono, to please the authorities. The Bakufu demanded that hinin hair be cropped to the quote-unquote according to the old manner, though hinin bosses were exempt from this mandate. Hinin women were not to blacken their teeth like commoner women, nor shave their eyebrows. Henceforth, hinin were prohibited from wearing hats. Even hinin children were ordered not to wear clothing extending below the knees. A month later, group responsibility was strengthened in ways that again differentiated hinin from commoners. When a hinin committed arson, for example, the hinin head who controlled the perpetrator was to be charged a 10 kanmon fine. The hinin head was then to extract a suitable fine from the hut head responsible. So you see the problems of group identity. If 3 or more culprits were discovered, even Danzemon was to be assessed a 30 kanmon fine. Only if Danzemon or a hinin boss himself apprehended the evildoers were such fines not levied. A month later, on 18 December 1723, the authorities showed they meant business. They assembled 3,659 hinin in Edo and gave them haircuts. All hinin of the 8 Kanto provinces were ordered to receive the same. Then, to etch the impression of zero tolerance firmly into the minds of all outcasts, 43 hinin deemed guilty of arson were burned alive. Further restrictions and mandates, designed chiefly to reinforce the hierarchical order of the hinin community, were added in later years. From May 1781, hinin were required to carry a wooden license tag, approximately 2 by 1.5 inches in size. This permit was distributed to hut heads by Kuruma Zenchichi or one of the other bosses. The quote-unquote hut head then issued it to the hinin under his charge. Measures whose importance can hardly be overestimated rendered hinin status hereditary. People born of hinin parents were barred from ever escaping their status. Only non-outcasts who had been demoted to hinin status might, under certain conditions, quote-unquote, wash their feet and be reintegrated into commoner society. In order to revert to non-hinin status, a person had to have been a hinin for less than 10 years. Troublesome petitions and oaths were required, as was money from the individual's relatives. Once these hurdles were cleared, an elaborate ceremony of purification was performed, and the Hinin was again deemed a commoner. Let's check out what this table says. Oh, this is insane. Okay. Although some people had fallen to Hinin status because of crimes, adulterous relations with a close relative, bungled double suicides, so they tried to do double suicide but ended up not being able to kill themselves, gambling, selling fraudulent lottery tickets, wounding a divorced wife, and the like. The magnitude of population figures cited in Table 1 suggests that the vast majority of Hinin ended up as such simply because they were desperately poor or because they had been born into this class. How quote unquote other Hinin in Table 1 were counted remains unclear. Perhaps these people were simply indigents who appeared when government handouts were granted. The figures गवर्नमेंट हैंड आउट फ्रीबीज देने के लिए आ गया तो उसको हिनिन घोषित कर दिया गया. दिस इज द प्रॉब्लम विद फ्रीबीज. Today we might not call them, but that is how the state indirectly or directly ends up looking at them. That is how their life in the end becomes. You become a beggar. How other Hinin, okay. The figures available for other Hinin may thus represent only part of the population that government officials labeled the new Hinin or Shin Hinin or later wild Hinin, also called No Hinin or Nobinin. From the 18th century, vagrants were increasingly viewed as a major problem by Edo city administrators. Unlike the Edo Kawata or Eta population, which was relatively small, and effectively contained within Danzamon's sokage, many types of beggars and vagrants or homeless or mushuku roamed throughout the city and irritated the public. Already from the 17th century, the Bakufu saw in Zenshichi's administration a convenient way of controlling such quote-unquote undesirables. But policy towards vagrants became highly discriminatory only during the Kyoho era, 1716 through 1736. Until that time, drifters and mendicants in Edo were often simply sent home after being arrested. In some cases, the government or Hinin heads had even granted quote-unquote temporary huts or karigoya and food to those with nowhere else to turn. On 28th February 1675, for example, the city built 60 temporary huts 4 by 5 meters in size for the new Hinin, probably beggars who had arrived from the countryside at Yanagihara. Each new Hinin, quote unquote new Hinin, was awarded miso, firewood, and a measure of rice, go of rice. In little more than 3 months, 692 indigents, including 33 women, had moved in. When these temporary shelters were abolished on 2nd June 1675, some inhabitants were dismissed and others placed permanently under a Hinin boss. In later years, similar huts were erected at Honjo Kueme Mura on 8th December 1701, on 8th December 1714 in Nakahashi, and on 11th December 1714 at Nihonbashi and Edobashi. In 1724, soon after Danzamon had won his suit against Zenshichi, the Bakufu began to revise earlier policy, ordering that the number of new Hinin, quote-unquote new Hinin, should now be limited. Some 10 years later, when severe famine swept the land and when even permanent Edo residents, quote-unquote, especially those living on back streets, artisans, day laborers, and others who earn a daily wage, faced, quote-unquote, desperate hardship, a new wave of rural refugees surged into the capital. As conditions worsened, rioting and looting erupted. These events inspired administrators to rethink policy toward unregistered beggars once again. On 22nd January 1734, the Bakufu, evidently believing that the promise of quote-unquote temporary huts and food was stimulating immigration, they realized that it's becoming an incentive structure of immigrating into the city, demanded that all vagrants and beggars henceforth be turned into registered Hinin. Those who had avoided arrest were deemed illegal and termed wild Hinin. Okay, so it's a band-aid. Instead of giving that bullshit incentive, they should have not given that incentive, but instead what they do is now try to find out or create a register and spend more government funds. In the following years, this new policy was enforced with considerable zeal. On 20th January 1742, the Bakufu ordered Danzamon to round up all wild Hinin in the city, cut their hair, and register them with the official Hinin bosses, who could use them as laborers. It was noted that many homeless were gathering at open spaces in Honjo and elsewhere, presenting, among other things, a traffic hazard. From 21st January 1742 to 5th April 1742, some 742 people were arrested. All but 4 were obligated to become registered Hinin. Immediately thereafter, from 6th April 1742 to 29th April 1743, some 922 others were deprived of their liberty and forced to register. कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे. Estraul is saying, Estraul, kisko stupid bola bhosike. By the way, you are too stupid to understand the real implications of these claims. Okay, कोई बवाल चल रहा है comment section में. Others were deprived of their liberty and forced to register. Already before the roundup was complete, on 15th April, laws had been revised to deter escapes. Previous decrees had stipulated that any suspicious Hinin should be handcuffed and turned over to his or her superior. Are, he was calling himself stupid, claims that caste has nothing to do with... okay, but you yourself said caste has nothing to do with Hinduism, right? Dada, there's a video by U-Turn English on JSD. You should review it. It's very short, just 20 minutes. Okay. We'll check on the days we do the audience introduction, okay? Okay. So anyway, so already before the roundup was complete, on 15th April, laws had been revised to deter escapes. Previous decrees had stipulated that any suspicious Hinin should be handcuffed and turned over to his or her superior. Anyone caught attempting to flee a second time was to be incarcerated for an unspecified amount of time before being returned. A third try was rewarded with banishment to a rural area and placement under the control of the local Hinin head. Since an escapee was likely to elude a rural captor no less deftly than an urban one, from April 1743, the law was toughened anew. Again, it was toughened. A bungled escape landed a Hinin in jail and meant a tattoo on the upper arm, a stripe a third of an inch wide, a third of an inch wide and 2 inches long. That was a tattoo. A second and third failed escape attempt meant an additional sign of infamy of equal size. A further unsuccessful try was repaid with death. Wow. From 1792, it was decided that any absconding outcast should be the object of a search in perpetuity. By contrast, non-criminal peasants who absconded were simply to be removed from the register. From 5th August 1814, provisions for tattooing were once more enhanced, with the first abscondence meaning a lengthwise stripe and a second one a stripe all the way around the wrist. A third attempt meant death. Measures of control in Edo, decreed from the mid-18th century to early 19th centuries, should be placed in the context of Bakufu policies, reinforcing discriminatory practices and perceptions against outcast groups on a national scale. From the 1760s, the Bakufu redoubled its efforts to utilize outcasts as a police force against masterless samurai or ronin and others who were causing trouble throughout the land. Laws demanding Kawata or Eta and Hinin to arrest ronin beggars in the 8 Kanto provinces had already been issued in 1769 and 1772, but in October 1778, after it was discovered that outcasts in Hiroshima had been cooperating with thieves rather than arresting them, the Bakufu promulgated a new edict, important not just because it restricted outcast practices, but because it was the first law to cover all Kawata, Eta, and Hinin throughout the land. Quote, recently, the manners of Eta and Hinin types have deteriorated. Hinin types. They make unwarranted demands of peasants or disguise themselves as peasants and enter inns, businesses, and bars. When they are discovered, they argue, which is embarrassing for peasants and townspeople. So they are excused, which only causes them to increase their demands, end quote. The ordinance then describes the supposed collusion of outcasts and criminals in the Hiroshima area and orders all those suspected to be engaging in illegal activity to be arrested no matter where they lived. This edict effectively turned outcasts into a nationwide police force, much feared by the majority force. Crackdowns on illegal beggars in Edo continued thereafter. These manhunts were usually headed by Danzamon, probably following the orders of superiors, and carried out by registered Hinin, who also patrolled the city during quote-unquote normal times and arrested vagrants on a regular basis. In 1784, during the so-called Tenmei famines, some 722 homeless were detained, placed within huts on Danzamon's premises, and eventually set back to their rural hometowns. In the following decades, more arrests occurred, but little is known of these. Renewed efforts to arrest and control vagabonds and beggars in Edo occurred during the Tenpo famines of the 1830s. Huts were constructed in 1833 through 1834 and 1836 through 1837 and filled with captured wild Hinin, quote unquote wild Hinin, who were then divided among rural Hinin bosses ruled by Danzamon. Again in 1839 through 1840, new crackdowns took place. Once more in 1842, as part of the Tenpo reforms, large numbers of homeless were nabbed and forced to return to their home provinces or register themselves as official Hinin within the city. Despite the laws designed to prevent Hinin from absconding, those subject to resignation and control often disobeyed. Already, the population statistics in Table 1 suggest a gradual trend for the impoverished people to avoid becoming registered Hinin. The able-bodied escaped as soon as they could, leaving behind the aged and the ill, who were not fit for official duties, much to the annoyance of Zenchichi and city officials. Even Matsuemon himself was known to have deserted. Wow. On the night of 28 June 1776, he simply disappeared, along with his wife and child. Next subchapter. Okay, Brahmacharya is saying, I first told this channel, but Dada neglected my comment as you always do. Okay, if I miss a comment, repeat that comment simply. Okay, I have no hatred for spams. I won't even call it a spam. I can obviously miss some messages, right? Because it's going on scrolling upwards automatically. Let's see, what were you saying? Caste and class are mixed there, as you do not scrutinize the system, so you cannot find caste. You can still see blacksmith's surname of England critters. Yes. It is a never-ending loop. Our Dharmacharya is classified based on its presence and provide a description on each caste to practice Adhyatma as per their inner psychology. Thus proving the point that British solidified the Varna system according to their social class system back in GB. Great Britain. Okay. Occupations, duties, and increasing hardship. Oppressive edicts, flagrantly biased legal decisions, and inhuman discriminatory policies thus played a major role in solidifying and reproducing the Edo outcaste order. Discrimination was further amplified by occupational and economic factors, not because any job was more intrinsically polluting than any other, or even simply because most outcasts were paid only a starvation wage, but because outcasts could be forced to work at jobs that others shunned, including those considered polluting. Since all Edo Kawataeta were required to live at Shincho, in fact some surreptitiously resided and operated elsewhere, most of their domiciles and workshops were physically separated from those of commoners and warriors. Some townspeople, guided by religious taboos on the taking of life and vaguely aware of sanctions imposed on some medieval Kawaramono, may have believed that working with leather was essentially polluting. Many more must have been repelled by the Kawataeta's duty of serving at executions, a duty that again linked the latter to medieval Kawaramono, ironically enough, for revered warrior heroes had risen because revered warrior heroes had risen to fame, sometimes even becoming the subject of religious veneration, precisely because they were such singularly efficient killers. Okay. तो वो था status, बाद में वो status change हो गया of killers. Hinin in the capital seem to have been charged with a gradually expanding number of obligations and responsibilities. During the latter half of the era, in a 15-article affidavit, Zenchichi presented each year on January 17, I guess, or 17th January, 17th January, to Danzamon, the Hinin promised that all suspicious individuals would be arrested, that laws would be properly transmitted to the Gommune, and that Danzamon would be supplied with 2,600 laborers or man days a year. Begging practices were carefully limited as well. Nobody was to smoke while begging, go out at night, fight, or threaten others. Backstreet homes were to be visited for soliciting alms only after residents of homes facing the major streets of the ward gave permission. For following these rules, it was confirmed that Zenchichi was allowed to control all Hinin from Shinbashi to Asakusa. The other three Hinin heads appeared to have followed similar practices. The outcast order was thereby reaffirmed on an annual basis. Every year, the outcast order was reaffirmed. Official Hinin duties came to include many that were easily linked to ancient notions of pollution, that is, skinning and disposing of dead animals, assisting the Kawata or Eta at executions, guarding and cleaning the Bakufu jail, work at the two tame, transporting prisoners, apprehending illegal beggars, and tattooing convicts, and parading them through town when this was part of a sentence, when this used to be a part of the sentence. Zenshiji provided official services to the Kotsukapara. Zenshiji provided official services to the Kotsukapara execution ground and graveyard, established in 1667. Similarly, Matsuemon provided guards and laborers to the Suzugamori execution ground, established in 1651. The majority of Edo Hinin activities, however, were not linked to death, prisons, or criminals. Hinin begged, provided various types of street performances, labored at the Bakufu's herbarium of official plants at Koishikawa, cleared the streets of wood and paper debris, repaired the sandals, and worked in many other capacities. As the number of Hinin duties increased and as Hinin found themselves ever more firmly locked into a socio-political and economic system that gave them little room to maneuver, Hinin fortunes fell. Reasons for this decline were spelled out by Zenchichi and Matsuemon in 1821 in documents filed with a petition for daily begging, or hikanjin. These records again indicate that it was not simply polluting occupations that had turned Hinin into outcasts, but rather that some jobs were considered polluting when they were performed by the Hinin. Wow, wow, wow. Recently, the two bosses noted scrap wood used for used as kindling by bathhouses was being picked up by bathhouse employees, carpenters or firemen, cart pullers, and other non-Hinin who sold what they found to bathhouses. Townspeople were keeping the rivers clean themselves rather than paying Hinin to do it. Competition in the business of street performing was fierce from vagrants living at flop houses, including ones run by the pseudo-religious street performers known as Ganinbozu, who postured as monks soliciting religious donations. Other quote-unquote wild Hinin were building quote-unquote huts on Easy Street, Kirakugoya, extorting money from shops, and inspiring registered Hinin to desert and lead what was judged by some a worry-free and merry life. The Bakufu appeared to have been impressed by these arguments, perhaps concerned that the Hinin might become dangerously disobedient or unable to fulfill their official duties, thus debilitating the outcast order that had been so carefully set in place. Daily begging, quote-unquote daily begging, was permitted in 1822. Until this time, Hinin had been allowed to collect donations only on officially sanctioned occasions, such as the days immediately preceding and following New Year's, the 5 annual holidays, Goseku, and other festive or mournful times, though such regulations were rarely needed. Near the end of the Tokugawa period, regular monthly contributions between 64 and 100 coppers or mon, 100 mon a year for each house facing a major street in each ward were also expected from the townspeople. Such donations were collected by Hinin superiors who shared the proceeds with their charges. The approval of daily begging now meant that inhabitants of each house facing a major thoroughfare were to award the Hinin associated with the ward 1 copper per day. The Hinin bosses must have hoped this money would fortify their organization. क्या काम नहीं है दिन में बैठ के, क्या क्या चूतिया का चीजें रेगुलेट करता है देखो गवर्नमेंट बैठ के, ठीक है. Yet to no avail. A report from September 1825 laments that despite the quote-unquote daily begging allowance, Hinin earned less than ever, probably largely because of spiraling numbers of desertions, competition from commoners, and the failure of the citizens to contribute to their daily penny. Zentrichi's income, which had stood at 416 ryo in 1822, had shriveled to 16 ryo by 1845. Other heads experienced a similar downturn in revenues. The disastrous famines of the mid-1830s had not helped either. During these years, thousands of destitute peasants had flocked into the capital, looking for ways to stave off starvation. This turned the activity of begging into a highly competitive business, as it is now. Hinin who took to extortionate modes of solicitation in order to obtain what had once been more easily obtainable were countered by new Bakufu edicts. Edict ke upar edict, edict pe edict. Although intimidation had been a common practice on all levels of society for centuries, Danzemon and Zenchichi were again ordered to inform Hinin hut heads that threatening modes of begging were strictly forbidden. लॉ के ऊपर लॉ बनाया जा रहा है, ये क्रिमिनल लोग और काउंटर क्रिमिनल एक्टिविटीज करते फिर रहे हैं, उसके लिए और एक और लॉ. Yet, as official snoops recorded in accounts of Edo manners from June 1841, outcasts as well as the blind were still employing high pressure tactics when claiming rewards on felicitous and mournful occasions. A month later, sleuths reported, meaning detectives, snoops reported that when hinin and beggars arrived at townsmen homes to claim sums, quote unquote, appropriate to the station or to the status of the person concerned, they might produce a quote unquote register that backed up bids for a larger amount. On yet other occasions, large groups of hinin women and children appeared on the 15th or final day of each month and stood before homes or shops, vocalizing insulting invective and impeding business if a proper donation was not received. तो ये हिनिन के साथ हमारा सबसे ज्यादा सिमिलरिटी जो दिख रहा है वो तो हमारे हिजरों के साथ है ना, the Hijra community. Hinin finances must have been, you will be bullied and embarrassed and shamed into giving them alms. Hinin finances must have been further drained by the earlier mentioned Bakufu demands that Zenchichi round up thousands of wild hinin in 1839 and 1842. Zenchichi was also ordered to oversee a hinin workhouse, Yoseba, that was constructed in 1843. Here, over 100 wild hinin captured in the city produced straw sandals and other objects. Now, subterfuge and resistance. Yes, Nandish. Did you all hear 1% reservation for transgenders from now on? Some High Court, I think Chennai High Court declared, Madras High Court. Okay. Despite official and unofficial forms of discrimination and constant attempts to lock each type of person into an appropriate, quote unquote, appropriate occupational and social category, defiance, often at a great personal cost to the resistor, became increasingly common as the Tokugawa period drew to its close. Seen from the point of view of officialdom, such resistance provided unambiguous proof that society was becoming more disorderly. From the point of view of the resistor, it was merely a natural result of increasing numbers of prohibitions. Increasing numbers of prohibitions. The more activities were criminalized, the more criminals would appear. An argument in favor of libertarianism. देखो, क्यों लॉज से कुछ समाधान नहीं होता है? The more activities were criminalized, the more criminals would appear. The establishment of a rigid order meant that disorder was now likely to be found everywhere one looked. Examples of disobedience and resistance in the Kanto area are recorded as early as 1657, when Kawata of the Kawago domain in Musashi province near Edo barked at orders to serve as torturers and executioners. They refused to cooperate until threatened with being deprived of their rights at the marketplace. Okay, वहां पे भीख मांगने नहीं देंगे, इसलिए काम करना शुरू किया. That 18th century Edo outcasts, like their peers in other areas of the land, often crossed the border between their own and commoner groups, can be read from Ogiu Sorai's lament that, quote, in recent years, the old rules have lapsed. Commoner women are sold as prostitutes and Kawaramono become merchants, end quote. Kya ho gaya hai desh ka? So, staticism again. A new staticism. Late 18th century legal documents indicate that outcasts posed as retainers of warriors secretly married commoners and worked as apprentices in commoner shops, sometimes even with the knowledge of the owner. In 1765, so many hinin were refusing to wear the prescribed clothing and hairdo that a new law was issued to remind them of their duties. By 1796, even Danzemon admitted that many hinin looked very much like commoners, in part because they were wrapping kerchiefs around their heads to cover up their short hair. Edo outcasts were purchasing homes in commoner quarters, leading to interminable bakufu debates regarding what to do with the property once they were found out and arrested. Segregation proved entirely unrealistic at tea houses and restaurants, where hinin mixed with and entertained commoners and warriors. Throughout the Tokugawa period, Edo hinin resisted when they could, hiding their status identity and sending their offspring or spouses into the city to become shop hands, waitresses, or, when all else failed, filet de joie. By the 19th century, some Edo hinin had realized that despite repeated bakufu attempts to restore quote-unquote order, money often talked louder than law. Incentive servopari. Economic incentives drives society. No fucking other thing, okay? In 1805, 19, okay, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September. In September 1905, a particularly remarkable example of Henin success was revealed when the authorities discovered that Sansuke, a Henin huthead at the 6th block of Sanjikenbori in Edo, owned a two-story home over 100 square meters in size, outfitted with a double reinforced frame, a vestibule, ceiling, paper windows, sliding screen partitions, guest room, and even a tea room. The garden featured an artificial hill and a spring that drew its water from a nearby river. Two butlers, two maids, a hairdresser, and two mistresses resided in Sansuke's home, along with some 30 others. Sansuke even hired a blind masseur who doubled as a koto instructor for his daughter. Wow, wow, wow. You all know what's koto, right? It's a famous Japanese string instrument, as far as I remembered. For living in such luxury, for wearing silk clothing, and for indiscriminately mingling with commoners, Sansuke was arrested and sentenced to exile. Twist. Kahani mein twist. The Ottawa and Kobikicho ward heads, who had presumably known about this state of affairs and failed to report it, and some 4 dozen others were also imprisoned, still others were placed under house arrest. Sansuke no doubt presented a particularly flamboyant exception to an otherwise unhappy rule, yet in his behavior, even if it was only a fraction of what was reported, one can detect a healthy disrespect for oppressive sanctions that must have been shared by many of his less fortunate peers. To quote Jordan Peterson, the way to end discrimination, the way to end staticism, I'm paraphrasing Jordan Peterson here, to even make people aware of environmental concerns, etc., make as many people as rich as possible in the least amount of time possible. Yet in his behavior, even if it was only a fraction of what was reported, one can detect a healthy disrespect for capitalism comes to the rescue, guys. Healthy disrespect for oppressive sanctions that must have been shared by many of his less fortunate peers. One may also discern a laissez-faire attitude among some of the townspeople supposed to be policing him. वो तो होगा ही, अमीर है, laissez-faire by the people usually want to be laissez-faire because it's easier to be laissez-faire. Unfortunately, Sansuke's efforts, like the protests of most Tokugawa period outcasts, provided a convenient excuse for the Bakufu to clamp down even harder on those who were attempting to mitigate their own suffering. Examples of disobedience allowed the state to intensify punishment for transgressors, to promulgate laws that reiterated the fundamental and quote-unquote natural differences between outcasts and commoners, and to demand new and more exacting duties to be fulfilled. Such efforts were backed by ideologues who penned discourses defining the nature of pollution, quote-unquote pollution. So the socialist trads defeat capitalism and libertarianism and fuck people. What a common universal story we are back at again. And justified the use of this concept to keep outcasts in their place, as if social status were something natural, inevitable, and eternal. The limits of micropolitics against massive state-backed institutions of oppression, recognized as legitimate by majority society, became strikingly evident in the ability of Tokugawa period outcasts to liberate themselves. Wow, brilliant paper. Conclusion, guys. By the second half of the Tokugawa period, a combination of political, economic, legal, ideological, and religious forces had produced a rigid, systematic, and state-sanctioned order of discrimination in the capital, where certain people were relegated to a position deemed outside, quote-unquote, and below commoner society. Edo provides a good example of how this was done, but it was by no means unique. The manner in which outcasts were ordered and governed differed according to the age and the place in question. But whether the administrative apparatus centered on secular institutions, that is in the case of Danzemon's administration in Edo, or on religious ones, for example, the hidden in Kyoto, outcast orders throughout the land were created gradually through political, juridical, and economic means, and fortified by cultural and ideological forces whose roots reached back to the medieval era. Yet even though medieval precedent regarding quote-unquote polluting occupations and the clergy's teachings regarding blood or death helped maintain and justify what some have termed a status beyond status. Let's say by this they mean obviously a status that is untouched by the ever-evolving status currently in society. Such ideas in themselves would have had little force or effect had they not been linked to exploitative political and economic practices that benefited some and harmed others. So in the end, what this author is saying is, in the end, economic incentives, fucked up economic incentives, kept these people down, rigidified these so-called hierarchies. Okay, brilliant. This seems to be a paper in favor of a paper defending libertarianism or free markets. In the end, the existence of an outcast order testified not just to inherent flaws in Confucian, Shinto, or Buddhist ideologies, though it did that too, but also laid bare the disastrous failure of the Tokugawa political and economic system to foster a just and humane society. That failure continued to disfigure Japan long after outcasts were nominally quote-unquote liberated on 28th August 1871. Its legacy still plagues the nation today. What a beautiful fucking paper. Brilliant. Yamanashi University. अरे ये सब रिसर्च करने को कोई पैसा दो यहाँ के स्कॉलर्स को भाई. Amazing. Let me check some comments. That's the end of this paper. What is Kolkata culture, bro? Nandish is saying even North Korea has caste system called the Songban system. I see. That means capitalism is what makes caste better. In what way? There has to be limit to material aspiration. Yeah, but that limit has to come out of your own because of the overall social discourse. It can't come from the state. Okay, तब तो चुतियापा शुरू होगा ना. स्टेट बोलेगा कि देखो हम तो तुमसे इतना टैक्स लेके उड़ा रहे हैं यहाँ वहाँ, क्योंकि गरीबी में ही तो मतलब पॉवर्टी इज ब्यूटीफुल. कहीं से गीता वीता से कहीं से उठा के कोड भी तुमको सुना देगा कि अमीरी में क्या रखा है. कैपिटलिज्म, फ्री मार्केट्स आर बैड, बीइंग रिच इज बैड. ये स्टेट से कभी नहीं होना चाहिए. दिस शुड बी योर ओन सेल्फ अवेकनिंग. स्टेट का एकमात्र कर्तव्य है प्रोटेक्शन ऑफ लाइफ, लिबर्टी एंड प्रॉपर्टी. It removes the discrimination and brings mobility. Yes, of course. By the way, saying Akhondo tomar ki hocche Nirajan. Okay. Kolkata culture right now is only based on nostalgia. Kolkata culture, a bit of nostalgia, mainly nostalgia and some hopes that some nice things are happening. There's a gigantic encouragement, no, in the Kolkata culture because they have defeated Hindu fascism again. तो उससे वो जो डोपामिन रश हुआ है उसके ऊपर से अब थोड़ा नाचेंगे और कुछ दिन फिर. Okay, thanks for joining, guys. This was a fantastic paper. Tomorrow we will discuss an outsider Bengali, which we call Probashi Bangali, a Probashi Bangali perspective on Hindu fascism living in Assam. Okay, how that BJP run state is doing better or worse than Bengal. Okay, thanks for joining, guys. Bye bye. Good night.
श्रवरूढं महाभीमं गुणाद्रष्टाङ्गरप्रदम् अस्य युक्तं त्रिनेत्रं च कपालकर्णिकाकरान् मुक्तकेशीं ललज्जयः पिबन्तीं रुधिरं चतुर्बाहु समायुक्तं वराभयकरं स्मरेत्. चतुर्बाहु समायुक्तं वराभयकरं स्मरेत्. काली काली महाकाली काली के पापहारिणी धर्मर्थ मोक्ष दे